of our orientation session. If you haven't been able to join us on previous days, I wanted to provide a brief recap of what we've seen so far. On day one of our orientation, we were joined by Melina and Jing, who took us through a big picture understanding of what global biodiversity is, what the global biodiversity crisis entails, and some of the drivers of that biodiversity crisis. Ying then talked to us a little bit about the role that Indigenous people have played and continue to play, not just in the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity, but also in the UN process. She helped us get a very clear visual picture on the importance of Indigenous people in biodiversity conservation. Yesterday, we moved on from the global picture to the more grounded understanding of the convention itself. So what is the convention, how it works, who are the parties, who are observers, how negotiations are held, how decisions are made. And that was Christian who took us through that presentation. There was a lot of information, I know, and if you still have questions from yesterday, please feel free to share them in the chat, because we know it's a lot to take in for one day. And then yesterday, we also went a little bit into how we, as individuals, as youth, as Indigenous people, as women, can participate in the Convention on Biological Diversity. So now that we've gone through the global and we focused in specifically on the convention itself, today we're going to focus on two very specific things. Sefa, who will take us through the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. And then I will take you through the upcoming informal SBSTTA meetings. We're really keeping our fingers crossed that we can allow a lot of time for discussion today. I know Gibbon and the ICCA consortium need to work in their own groups to strategize about how to participate in these upcoming meetings. Again, if you have any questions from yesterday, if something is unclear, if you'd like clarification, please use the chat. Drop your questions in there. We'll try to answer them in the chat. If we don't get to them, we'll circulate them after. And also, we will try and address them in the breakout groups. One pending task for me, which I talked about yesterday, was that I had offered to share the links to the 4 major interest groups for the CBD. So I am going to do that now in the chat for all of those who requested it. Don't worry if you can't see it clearly. I will also make sure to put it in the minutes for you to check them out and reach out to them as necessary. So without further ado, I would like to introduce Sefa, who is a member here as a member of Gibbon, but also an honorary member of the ICCA consortium. She is one of the most dynamic Indigenous youth leaders in the biodiversity movement, and it is really an honor to have her here with us today and have her share some of her knowledge with us. Gracias, Sefa.
Thank you so much, Ame. Yes, so today we're going to be talking about the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, what it is and how it looks, how the process is, and some reflections also on it. Okay, so last year, 2020, was supposed to be the biodiversity super year for nature, because that was supposed to be the year that the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework was supposed to be adopted by world leaders as a big step towards achieving the long-term vision for nature, which is living in harmony with nature. And now this super year has extended into 2021, given the circumstances with COVID-19. And so just to clarify again, what the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is, it is a global strategic plan for biodiversity that's being developed under the Convention on Biological Diversity. It is a global agreement that will define the global actions to address biodiversity loss in the next decades. And it is replacing the previous strategic plan, which had a time frame of 2011 to 2020. And so this previous strategic plan has basically expired. And so this next plan should will replace that and should improve also upon it. So because as Christian said yesterday, we have not achieved many of the targets from that plan. And so the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is going to be adopted at the next meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the CBD, which is the 15th meeting of the COP. And it was originally scheduled to happen in Kunming, China last year in October 2020, but again has been postponed. We don't know when it is happening yet. It might happen later this year or early next year from what we know so far. Okay. And the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is primarily being negotiated under a working group that was formed by the COP. So it's the open-ended working group on the post-2020 GBF. And so this is what we'll be calling OEWG, and this is how it's abbreviated. So when we refer to OEWG, this is what we're talking about. So this working group, which is tasked to develop the post-2020 framework, is being chaired by two co-chairs. They are Francis Ogwal from Uganda and Basil Van Hav from Canada. And you'll see them here, and you will probably see them also during the informal sessions that are coming up. So the expectations for this framework is that it's not going to be just a framework for governments and the parties, but it's rather like going to be a guiding framework for all, for civil society, for UN bodies, for indigenous peoples, women, youth, business, academia, etc. It's expected that the development of this framework will be inclusive and participatory, and therefore will allow participation from indigenous peoples, women, youth, and others. That it will be a strong step towards achieving that long-term vision of living in harmony with nature. That it will provide us some milestones that we need to achieve by 2030 towards that vision, and that it will have goals and targets that are measurable and achievable. So currently, where are we in the process of developing this framework? So as Christian and Amiali explained earlier, there's an intersessional process between COPs where much of the decisions are being made. Like a sandwich. I remember that Amiali described it like a sandwich, where like the meaty parts where stuff are being decided comes in between the major COP meetings, which happens every 2 years, roughly every 2 years, right? And so at the last COP, which happened in November 2018, they started this process of developing the framework. They then had a series of consultations. Then they had the first meeting of the working group, which happened in August 2019 in Kenya. They had the 23rd meeting of SBSTTA and the 11th meeting of the working group on Article 8J. Then they had the second meeting of the working group in Rome, Italy last February 2019. 2020, I'm sorry. So after this, essentially like COVID happened. And so the rest of the process has been moved significantly from when they were originally supposed to happen. But right now we're here, right between OEWG2 and the next SBSTTA and SBI meetings, which are not the ones happening this week. But rather the ones happening this week are kind of preparatory meetings for that one. Okay, And so these were the regional consultations that happened. They happened in Asia Pacific, Western Europe, Africa, Central and Eastern Europe, and Latin America and the Caribbean. They had some thematic consultations close last year, focusing on certain topics that were of interest to the CBD as well as other groups who initiated some of these processes also. For example, they had thematic consultations on human rights, on resource mobilization, on protected areas and conserved areas, on indigenous peoples and local communities, sustainable use, and many members of parties and many members of civil society also were able to take part in these discussions. And these consultations were informing the global biodiversity framework. And so basically the post-2020 global biodiversity framework evolved through this process. Initially, they only had a list of potential elements, and then they came up with a zero draft of this framework in January 2020. And they came up with an updated zero draft in August 2020. And this is what the version that we're kind of working with now, and that I'll be talking about in a moment. So before I do that, this is just to explain what's coming after, like what are the next meetings. So there's SBSTA, which will provide scientific and technical advice to the framework. SBI, which will provide advice on how the framework can be implemented. After that, they come up with the next version of the draft, which will be negotiated on, again, in the third meeting of the Open-Ended Working Group, or OEWG3. And then after that, they come up with a final draft, and then the final negotiations will happen at CBD COP15. So that's where we are right now. And so there's actually still a lot of places where we can try to advocate and influence this framework. So now I'm going to take you through the updated zero draft, because this is essentially what we are trying to influence since the development started, right? And this is the theory of change of this framework. So you can see that there's the 2050 vision of living in harmony with nature. And to reach that, they have set some goals for 2050 and some milestones by 2030 to reach those 2050 goals. And then they have some targets. They've grouped the targets into reducing threats to biodiversity, meeting people's needs, and tools and solutions that we need to arrive at those goals. Okay? So yes, just to remind everyone, the 2050 vision is living in harmony with nature, whereby by 2050, biodiversity is valued, conserved, restored, wisely used, maintaining ecosystem services, sustaining a healthy planet, and delivering benefits essential for all people. Okay? So this is what the framework currently looks like. This is, okay, I'm not going to comment. This is how they explain how the goals and the targets are somehow related to each other, right? So there's targets 1 to 7, which feed into the goal A, targets 8 to 12, which will feed into goal B. Target 12 feeds into goal C, and all of these here feed into goal D. But we'll take this step by step now. But essentially what you need to remember is that there are 20 targets currently and 4 goals, and then there's the vision. So, so the 2050 goals that they have put in the current draft are these. So first is the area, connectivity, and integrity of natural systems of natural ecosystems is increased. The second is nature's contributions to people are being valued, maintained, or enhanced. The third goal is the benefits from the utilization of genetic resources are shared fairly and equitably. And finally, that there are means of implementation to achieve all the goals and targets in the framework. So these are like the high level things that they want to achieve by 2050. And I didn't include the milestones here, but there are some milestones for what the progress would be towards these goals by 2030 that we would expect and try to have. Okay, so now we're going to the first group of targets, which is targets 1 to 7. If you remember, they were all grouped together under this category, reducing threats to biodiversity. And this set of targets primarily are aiming to address the direct drivers of biodiversity loss. So don't worry so much about the wording, but this is just to show you what a target looks like, I suppose. So, for example, the first target is that by 2030, land and sea is going to be put under spatial planning to address land and sea use change. The second one is that by 2030, we have a system of protected areas and other effective area-based conservation measures. But target 3 is on wild species of flora and fauna recovery and conservation. Target 4 is on ensuring the harvesting, trade, and use of wild species is legal, sustainable, and safe. Target 5 is on invasive alien species and addressing invasive alien species. Target 6 is on reducing pollution, and target 7 is on increasing contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptation. So this is the first group of targets, and I'm going to zoom into some of the targets that might be worth noting in this group because they are particularly expected to be kind of contentious. So target 2, for example, is on protected areas and conserved areas, right? And it says that by 2030, we will protect and conserve through well-connected and effective system of protected areas and other area-based conservation measures, at least 30% of the planet with focus on areas particularly important for biodiversity. So this is a target that has become a major concern for indigenous peoples and local communities. Because, for instance, currently the world's land has 15% protected areas, or 15% of the world's land is protected areas. And so to reach 2030, you would have to essentially double this percentage. But historically, expanding protected areas has led to many cases of human rights violations and expulsion of the traditional owners of these lands. And so the concern is that without first ensuring that the land and territorial rights of indigenous peoples and local communities are fully recognized, it's likely that this pattern will continue. And so it becomes dangerous especially in contexts where governments don't yet recognize land rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. So this is just a brief explanation of a very complex and contentious issue, but this is just for your information and guidance also. So target 7 also is a bit there is some concern about it. It is about increasing contributions to climate change mitigation and adaptation and disaster risk reduction from nature or through nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches, right? And there are some concerns about the terminology of nature-based solutions because, for instance, the focus on nature-based solutions has recently been on tree planting. But some often these refer to like monoculture or commercial plantations, which don't really have a lot of or they don't have a lot of benefit for biodiversity, right? And usually the expansion of these plantations is also being used for greenwashing, for corporate greenwashing, and they're using this as an excuse to continue using fossil fuels. Another reason is that many of these projects being framed as nature-based solutions ignore the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. And finally, like the term nature-based solutions has not been defined at all within the CBD. And therefore, it doesn't have the necessary safeguards, and basically anyone can put the definition that they want on nature-based solutions. Okay, so this is again just a quick overview of a very complex and contentious issue. So we're moving on to the next group of targets, which is on meeting people's needs through sustainable use and benefit sharing. So there are 5 targets under this group. The first one is about ensuring benefits, including nutrition, food security, livelihoods, health, and well-being for people, especially the most vulnerable, through sustainable management of wild flora and fauna. Okay. The next target is on supporting the resilience and sustainability of agriculture, of agricultural systems and other managed ecosystems like aquaculture, fisheries, forestry. The next target is on regulation of air quality and water also. The target 11 is about green and blue spaces for human health and well-being. And the last target on this group is about benefit sharing, which again is like, it means ensuring that benefits flow towards the countries or communities that provide genetic resources, especially if someone else is gaining profit from it. So this is the next group of targets. I'm not going to dwell too much on this. And then we have the last group, which are kind of meant to be cross-cutting because they apply to the other targets as well, which are on tools and solutions to achieve to achieve the objectives of the post-2020 framework. So target 13 is about mainstreaming biodiversity into other sectors. So basically ensuring that it is integrated into the whole government's policies, not just the environmental sector. That's what we refer to as mainstreaming. Target 14 is on ensuring that production and supply supply chains are sustainable. Target 15 is on eliminating unsustainable consumption patterns. And target 16 is on biosafety and ensuring that the potential adverse impacts of biotechnology are reduced. Okay, so these are the targets. This is just for us to know what's in the framework again. So there is a whole document where you can read the entire text later on. So going on to the final targets here. I can hear. Did someone want to speak? I'm sorry. Okay, I'll continue, but let me know. So target 17 is about eliminating incentives that are harmful to biodiversity and reducing the harmful subsidies, which Christian, I think, explained yesterday, wherein a lot of the subsidies are going to going to sectors and essentially causing adverse impacts to biodiversity. Target 18 is on ensuring that we have enough resources to to implement and mobilizing these resources. Target 19, okay, I'll go to target 19 now, which is, but that by 2030, we ensure that quality information, including traditional knowledge, is available to decision makers and the public for effective management of biodiversity through promoting awareness, education, and research. So this is quite an important target, especially for this group. It reflects a lot of important issues like traditional knowledge and education, which are key priorities. But there's also an issue where it's a lot of very important topics kind of mixed into one target, which makes it a bit difficult to ensure, for example, that we have that we are reflecting everything we want for a traditional knowledge target, and we are reflecting everything we want for an education target. You see? So it's, yeah, we will have to kind of watch this target also to ensure that none of these important parts of it get negotiated away, sort of. So target 20, finally, is about participation and ensuring equitable participation in decision-making, and ensuring rights over relevant resources of indigenous peoples and local communities, women and girls, as well as youth. So this is the participation target. And so it's great that this is here, and this is one of the ways where we can definitely like see ourselves and involve ourselves in the development of the particulars of it. But it's also an issue wherein equity and human rights are kind of being siloed into one target, and they're not being reflected in almost anywhere else, which should be the case, right? And we also need to work to ensure that the way that this is being monitored and reported on is appropriate and meaningful, and actually tells us the progress towards this target. So that's an overview of the targets. There are other sections also of the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework that I won't be able to get into, but there is like implementation support mechanisms, responsibility and transparency, outreach and awareness, and enabling conditions. And these enabling conditions actually contain a lot of very important things like they have participation of indigenous peoples and local communities, gender equality, intergenerational equity, um, and others that are important, but there's actually no way for us to monitor like how these are being fulfilled, because there are no indicators that are attached to them. Okay, so given that overview, I just wanted to also give a look into the priorities of indigenous peoples and local communities, and later on of youth. Okay, so one of them is like as a guiding principle that biological diversity and cultural diversity are actually very closely linked and mutually reinforcing. And so the framework should reflect this. Another is ensuring that indigenous peoples and local communities are able to govern and decide on what happens in their lands, given the importance of these lands to biodiversity, and ensuring that these lands are being recognized and fully respected also. So another is the acknowledgement of traditional knowledge or indigenous and local knowledge. Another is ensuring that environmental defenders are able to work in a safe and enabling environment, because unfortunately, as mentioned before, many of them are facing harassment and killings. And this should be a concern also of the CBD. Next, we have ensuring that customary sustainable use by indigenous peoples and local communities is being recognized and supported and not being criminalized, which is also happening in some countries, right? And finally, the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples and local communities in the decision-making processes and ensuring that their concerns and priorities are being heard and taken into consideration. So that's just a quick overview. Now moving on to the priorities of young people. So we are pushing overall for a framework, right, that addresses the root causes of biodiversity loss and that really puts equity of nature and all people at the center. So we hope for a framework that really prioritizes these three things: the integrity of our life support system, society living sustainably, and equity for nature and people. So this is more a high level vision for the framework. But also we have been prioritizing certain issues as young people be, because they have emerged from our consultations as prioritary. So one is intergenerational equity, ensuring that future generations are being taken into consideration, and of course the full and effective participation of youth. The second is transformative education. We are calling for an education that um, that is that moves beyond business as usual, and really fosters a society that is aware of their place in the web of life and is stewarding society to a world that is living in harmony with nature. And the third is taking rights-based approaches, and like ensuring human rights and the rights of nature in 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 biodiversity related actions. So there, and then just some final reflections. The current draft as it is not in any way near transformative enough to achieve living in harmony with nature. So we need to kind of uh, analyze and reflect and see how we can push it towards this. Second, we need to, given that it's not transformative enough yet, we must keep advocating for our priorities and put enough pressure on governments through our different processes to ensure that the language that we need to be there and that we can use again for implementation, or to put pressure on governments to implement these things. So we need to keep advocating for the language in the framework to be retained until COP15 when it is actually adopted. Third, unfortunately, like current political context around the world and the breakdown of democracy in many countries is affecting interests at the international level, which is really kind of limiting how transformative and ambitious this framework can be. But this is something we kind of have to work with it, and but finally, like some victories, like in international policy, they're not they don't happen right away. They might kind of take generations to achieve, but the framework, this post 2010 framework is not really the end all be all, and we can really try our best to get or to put the key things in there so that we can use these, like create the groundwork for future generations and people to continue the long-term objectives of what we're trying to achieve. So with that, I think I'm going to end and open for any questions if there are any. Thank you. I hope I didn't take too long.
Gracias, Cefa. That was fantastic and very clear and very, very useful. The post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is huge, and you've done an excellent job in helping us focus in on some key parts of it. So we do have a little bit of time for questions. Does anybody have a question that they'd like to ask? If you do, please raise your hand and we will unmute you. And if you'd like to ask a question via the chat, you're also welcome to do that. So are there any questions? I'm not seeing, oh yes, Ali. Go ahead, Ali.
Thank you. First of all, thank you, Sefa. Your presentation was wonderful, full of detailed information, very useful, very important, actually. I don't have question. Just want to share some of my thought with you about specifically about the content of human rights in the framework. Sefa is right. There are not enough emphasis on human rights in the draft of framework, the draft of the global biodiversity framework. However, we always should consider and emphasize that CBD is under the UN systems, and all state members are member of the UN. So they must respect and protect all kind of human rights recognized in the UN Charter, in two international covenant of political, civil rights, or social, cultural, and economic rights. So we have some erga omnes commitments for states that they should recognize, and they must respect and commit to realize that in all international and national framework they are. So it doesn't matter that in the draft of the framework they have not mentioned human rights enough. We should consider other international human rights framework in this regard. And my other points is that I agree with Safa that there are some specific goals in the framework of the global biodiversity framework that they are very critical for indigenous people and local communities. However, I think directly or indirectly, all targets are related to territories of life. We should not consider territories of life just as land. They are more than this. They are more than this, and we should consider that, for example, gene editing are affected by diversity. Biosafety will be affected the biodiversity too. So I think it will be good if we can consider and take consideration to all aspects of the framework. This is my 2 points. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Ali. That's absolutely correct. And we, like the IIFB, has constantly been pushing for certain elements that are relevant to indigenous peoples and local communities throughout the framework, not just Target 19 and Target 20. And unfortunately, like these have not yet exactly been reflected. And you're absolutely right also that the CBD should be working within the framework of the UN, which has the commitment to respect human rights, for sure. So, yes.
If I can just add a point to that, just to make a little bit clearer more about the process. So especially for the rights holders groups, which are like women, youth, like indigenous people and local communities, like those that are really standing for their rights and not merely like stakes or interests, like most of our priorities are cross-cutting, which means that it goes like across all the targets and any of the goals that they might propose. Okay, but it's kind of like, I don't like to use this and say that it's a little bit of a battleground, but in reality it is like every issue you have to imagine that it's like 192 countries coming together to discuss, plus all the lobby groups surrounding it, right? So like it's not always you're gonna get like, I mean, like in very few cases you're gonna get the best outcome. And I think what you said, Ali, is extremely important on how like what a robust framework for rights, for human rights we have in the whole UN system, and that is absolutely key. And I think that's what a lot of the advocates within the CBD process are trying to do, to connect those processes and remind those negotiators that they have committed, their countries have committed to human rights in other political forums. But you have to also understand that the negotiation of biodiversity issues falls mostly under the environmental ministries of our countries. And so, and we know how our countries are, those ministries don't talk with each other, right? So there is very little coordination. So we need to keep reminding people all the time, you know, what are the other commitments? And we should never take it for granted that because we have a robust framework in another place, we don't need to kind of like strengthen that in the CBD. And also because this connection between human rights, environmental degradation, equity, it's very clear for us. We are at the direct end of these impacts, but it's not clear for policymakers yet because the policies are so separated and so compartmentalized. So I just wanted to remind you guys that understanding this as like a dynamic process of many different interests coming together and people that don't necessarily see the whole picture. Okay, thank you.
Thank you, Melina and Sefa. I think we have time for one very quick question. Daniel, if your question is brief, please go ahead. You can unmute yourself.
Hi everyone. Just more than a question, is a comment in relation to Target 2 and the concept of other effective area-based conservation measures and how that phrase or that idea, you know, makes invisible the contribution of indigenous peoples to biodiversity, including indigenous peoples as other effective area-based conservation, does not reflect the importance of exercising collective rights in conservation. And I think that's very, it would be very important to challenge that and actually claim, you know, a specific visibilization of indigenous people's territories, you know, in Target 2. That's just one comment. And the second one is the importance in terms of advocacy of linking, you know, linking the loss of biodiversity to health, you know, particularly now in the context of the pandemic. I think it's very strategic. That's it. There's two things. Thank you.
Gracias, Daniel. Yes, the OECMs, or other effective-based conservation measures, is something that we will discuss, I think, more in the breakout groups. It is a topic that is being discussed widely, especially in relation to Target 2, as you mentioned. So it is something that we'll get into a little bit more, I think, in our separate breakout groups, as it relates differently to Gibbon as it does to ICCA Consortium. So we are unfortunately out of time. I did see Carolina's hand up. Carolina, if you could put your question in the chat, that would be wonderful. I'm hoping that with our next presentation, Marie's question will be answered and some other ones in the chat will be too. So if it's okay, please, if you have questions, please put them in the chat and we'll answer them as we are able to. And I think we should move on to our next presentation, which is me. So I get to introduce myself. Hi, everyone. I want to introduce myself. You all know me. So Sefa has set the stage really brilliantly for what comes next. I think Marie's question was spot on. Let me start sharing my screen here. 1 second. Okay. Oh, wait. Okay. And here we go. sorry. So I think Sefa's presentation set us up really brilliantly for what comes. And to answer Mari's question, where is all of this currently being negotiated? So if we remember what Sefa was telling us about between the COPs, there's all this meaty stuff between the sandwiches. And this usually happens in the subsidiary bodies. And the one that is currently in charge of or has been negotiating the text for the post-2020 process has been the open-ended working group with SBSTA. So right now I will take you through a little bit of SBSTA. We talked about it yesterday. If you remember, there are two subsidiary bodies in the CBD. One of them is SBSTA, the body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. Another one is the SBI, which deals more with implementation. So we'll get into that one a little bit later. So SBSTA, what does SBSTA do? So SBSTA provides scientific and technical guidance to the COP. So if you think about it, it gives kind of the scientific basis for what a lot of parties are negotiating. It's multidisciplinary. It's made up of government representatives. It's also open to observers. And SBSTA so far has met 23 times. This next meeting will be the 24th meeting of SBSTA. So if you see SBSTA 24, the 24 just means the meeting number, so which meeting comes next. All right. So I don't remember if you noted yesterday in Christian's presentation, but he had split up SBSTA and SBI. And SBSTA was really answering the question of what to do, what is needed from a scientific perspective, what is needed. And SBI answers the question of how to do it. It's more the implementation side of things. So right now we're focusing on the what to do, which is what Sefa presented a little bit in the Global Biodiversity Framework. It's the idea of what we should be doing. So I wanted to share a little bit about the history of SBSTA because I think it's important. So SBSTA has also always been this scientific and technological part of the CBD. But a lot of people, especially early on, before the creation of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, also known as IPBES, people were saying, well, you know, SBSTA is very political. Of course, SBSTA, the quality of SBSTA's work depends on the process and the materials these discussions are based. So it becomes, even though it's supposed to be more scientific, more of an assessment body, it is very political. So in the early 2009, 2010, people started saying, you know, we need a separate, less political, independent body to provide scientific assessment to SBSTA and the CBD. And so people got together and created IPBES, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. So IPBES. It supposedly is an independent intergovernmental body, but the idea was that, you know, the convention was a very political process. It's negotiated, it's influenced by political needs and political will. And IPBES was meant to provide this independent information. I put independent in quotation marks because IPBES is also highly political and government representatives are also part of IPBES. And so this independent body is not necessarily as independent as we would like. But I did want to flag it because a lot of information that comes into SBSTA comes from IPBES. So the processes are closely linked. So I did want everybody to kind of understand how they relate to each other. So Sefa presented this earlier to kind of situate us where we are in the process. The last in-person meeting was the open-ended working group #2 meeting in Rome in Italy in February. And then after that, COVID happened. So we had this timeline for COP15 and that pretty much after February went out the window. And right now, I think the CBD is trying to figure things out. This is unprecedented, has never happened before. People have always been able to meet in person. And even though that has presented challenges, people are quite concerned about what a virtual negotiation process would be like in terms of access to connectivity and other things. So I wanted to flag this as SBSTA and the CBD in the time of COVID. We're in a time of lots of uncertainties and unknowns in terms of the timelines and the process. There's also a lot of challenges with virtual participation, and there's a constant need to adapt and readapt. And one of the discussions that I thought was interesting was this: there was a lot of momentum for international solidarity. 2020 was going to be the big year for biodiversity and climate change. And when COVID happened, something really interesting was that international solidarity kind of shifted to nationalism. Everybody was worried about their country and their people and the closing of the borders. And so there's discussion of how the impact of COVID is actually influencing negotiations, where people were more focused on international solidarity. Now there's kind of more of a shift of, well, we need to deal with the economic crisis nationally, and we need to deal with things at a national level. And so we don't have as much energy or interest at the international level. And I think that has impacted, and maybe will impact more than we're aware, the negotiations with the CBD. So in terms of the virtual process for SBSTTA specifically, so this is really SBSTTA. A couple of things have happened since Rome. There was the peer-reviewed draft of the documents of the Draft Zero, which SEFA presented about on the Global Biodiversity Framework. So in July and August, parties and observers and civil society, indigenous people, youth, women, were granted the opportunity to peer review the draft. And someone requested the link to the draft document. So I put that in the chat, where you can go and download the whole Global Biodiversity Framework draft. So that happened in July and August. And in September, they released an updated Draft Zero. That came together with some virtual sessions. So all of a sudden, there was this need to keep momentum going toward a negotiation and an agreement, but people weren't sure how to do this. And so the CBD Secretariat, with governments and observers, planned a series of virtual sessions. There were some in September. There was also another virtual session in December, which Daniel mentioned, about the links between health and biodiversity. And I think it's worth mentioning that this special virtual session was focused specifically on biodiversity, One Health, and response to COVID-19. And that took place in December. And now the New Year's come, and we're in this moment of informal sessions. So this week, actually, the 17th, 18th, and 19th, and next week, 25th, 26th, 27th, SBSTTA will be hosting informal sessions. And we'll talk about the informal sessions more in our breakout groups, but I'll also give an overview here. Now, this has never happened before, as we said. We've always followed up, the CBD has always followed a program, met in person, negotiated, went away, met again in person, renegotiated, and that's how they made it to COP15. But because of this COVID crisis, we're not really entirely clear about whether these informal sessions will inform the negotiations in a formal way, or how they will be linked to the formal negotiation process. These sessions, I'll go into a little bit, they're the informal sessions of the 24th meeting of SBSTTA. And the CBD Secretariat released a scenario note, a note by the chair, to try and give us an idea of what these upcoming sessions would be like. Again, these are new, they've never happened before. This is an adaptation by the CBD to the COVID crisis. So they sent this scenario note, and the scenario note said that in these upcoming sessions, there would be an opportunity for interventions on pre-session documents. But there would be no negotiations, and there will be no formal substantive outcomes. So in a way, these upcoming meetings are part of the process, but not formally part of the process, but they will inform the process. So just a little bit there, I know it's confusing, but we're all navigating this new CBD COVID world. So on this agenda for the next couple days, again, the meetings are the 17th, 18th, and 19th of February, and the 24th, 25th, 26th of February. And they'll happen for 3 hours each day, Montreal time, 7 to 10 a.m. in Montreal, because that's where the CBD Secretariat is based. And these sessions will go through the SBSTTA agenda. And so what's on this agenda? There's the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework is one of the topics. Another topic is synthetic biology. Another one is risk assessment and risk management, marine and coastal biodiversity, biodiversity in agriculture, invasive alien species, and the IPBES program of work. So these are the kind of the laid out agenda items. The structure of it supposedly is that, as you can see in the notes there, it'll be an introduction by the Secretariat, and then the microphone will be open to parties. First, the major or the negotiating blocks. So the different regional groups will have a say first, and then parties. And then usually the 4 major groups get a chance to make a statement. And if there's time, then other observers can also make a statement, civil society organizations, etc. And each day, depending on the topic, they will open the meeting in this way. So for those who are unfamiliar with synthetic biology and risk assessment, because I know these are 2 topics that maybe are not as familiar to you as, oh dear, my computer's back. As, yeah, wait, sorry. They're not as familiar to you as other topics. So synthetic biology is a new field. It's looking at how, gosh, sorry, my computer's gone a little bit wacko. Can you guys still see my screen?
It's a bit blurred. So
It's a bit, sorry.
do you want to stop the sharing and start again, Amit? Now it's
Can
back.
you see it now? Yeah, let me.
Yeah, now it's back.
Now it's back.
Yeah, it's back. It's back.
Okay. Okay, sorry, I don't know what's wrong. Can you guys see it now?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, so synthetic biology
Oh,
is a new field of science that involves redesigning organisms for useful
Amit,
purposes, supposedly.
now we cannot anymore.
Yeah?
Like now we went back to the blurred.
Okay, sorry. I don't know what's happening with my computer here, guys. Okay, can you see it?
Yes.
Okay, well,
Yes.
hopefully I won't touch anything. It really doesn't do anything now. So synthetic biology is re-engineering organisms. So this sounds scary to a lot of us. It's very new to a lot of us. The CBD is doing work to understand it. And other organizations are also doing work. IUCN just coordinated a big assessment on what synthetic biology is. We can share more information about that, but it is on the agenda for the upcoming SBSTTA meetings. So I wanted to flag that there. And then risk management and risk assessment is another one that I think may be unclear to some of you. And that's just about understanding risk in general. For instance, you know, synthetic biology, the introduction of a new organism, what kind of risk does that present for biodiversity? And that's kind of the focus of that part of the agenda item. So there are agenda items on here that I think are of relevance, specifically, I know to the ICCA consortium, but I think to Gibbon also. And so it is definitely worth participating in these sessions, even if they're not formally part of the negotiation process. And so I wanted to stop there to end with this thought. So even though this upcoming SBSTTA work is not formally part of the negotiation process, for us as Gibbon and the ICCA consortium, I do think it provides a big opportunity for us to work collaboratively to strategize in our advocacy. So a lot of parties will make their statements, a lot of groups will make their statements, a lot of organizations will make statements, and it allows us to kind of track, okay, where is the discussion going? What are people saying? How does this reveal a little bit of their position on these issues? It also allows us an opportunity to identify which are the friendly parties. So which of these friendly parties can we approach? Say, you know, France gives a statement coming out very strongly in favor of human rights. Then we know that ICCA consortium and its members can approach France and say, look, we're specifically interested in human rights in the global biodiversity framework. How can we work together and strategize to make sure that appears more clearly? And it's also an opportunity for us to prepare for formal negotiations, which I think is also very worthwhile. So I know that's a lot and it's a little bit confusing. So feel free to ask questions. I'll stop screen sharing so we stop having these computer issues. So if you do have any questions, please feel free to ask. We have 5 minutes for question and answer. So I'll wait for some hands. Or I don't know if there were any in the chat. I wasn't following it. No questions on
Dolores, raising her hand, her physical hand, not her virtual hand.
Oh,
Go ahead.
Dolores, please go ahead.
Yes, I'm sorry. I cannot find the hands on the bottom. Anyhow, my question is, well, thank you for all. It's very interesting information. And okay, I have a concern in terms of the representativity of the example from my area. Example, we do like Wapashkus have identified the 8 sacred sites, and we did some kind of work to get them recognized as protected area. And within the new law that was agreed in December 2020 in Quebec, the government of Quebec, the environmental government have recognized some protected area to attain the 17% of the Canada target. And but one of the protected area that was defined is in the north of Quebec. However, and within that protected area that was recognized, we have 1 sacred sites in there. So we were kind of happy to have that, but at this point of time, it is very controversial subject, because the First Nations of Quebec, because we want to work to protect the areas. And within the government, the local government or band councils, they want to take this advantage to work towards to claim the land politically. They want to integrate that as a land claims opportunity, so which stops everything at the government level. So I'm trying to see how, if we do make any presentations out there or any commitments or interventions, because we are not governmental organization. We are non-governmental organization, and we are very careful of what we say and how we interfere, how we interact, because we don't want to. We do understand and we believe that all government political people have the right to do their land claims. But somehow it does give some obstacles towards the protected area issue. So I'm just wondering, how do we handle that? How can I handle that?
Yeah, I think that's a great question, Dolores. And I think the question of representation and possibility to participate is one that comes up a lot in the CBD process. And Melina and Sefa, please, and anyone else, please feel free to jump in. But I think one of the ways that you can ensure or you can participate is by, for instance, the ICCA consortium. If we make a statement, to be part of that statement and make sure that your interests are reflected in that statement. That also goes the same as, say, if it's an issue like you were mentioning about sacred sites and Indigenous people and lands, you might want to be in touch with the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity, the IIFB, and they also make a statement. And so if you're participating in that process, then your priorities can also be reflected in their statement. But mostly because if we remember that the CBD is political, the negotiations do happen by parties. Sometimes the most effective thing is to find a party that is friendly to your perspective and to kind of engage directly with them. But I don't know, Melina, do you have anything to add there, or Sefa?
Yes, I mean, I think in your case, Dolores, like you should know that the Canadian government is always very outspoken about the rights of Indigenous peoples and like the rights over land, at least at the national government level. So that's just Environment Canada. So it might be interesting to discuss with the government at the national level itself if there is any national like measures that can be taken, if there is any like possibility of negotiations at the national level with the provincial government to be able to do that. Another way like is that in those forums, like within the CBD, you will be able to meet like through different networks like IIFB or ICCA consortium or so on. You're going to be able to meet with a lot of other Indigenous peoples and local community representatives that have faced similar issues. And so there is in like normal COPs and CBD meetings, there is a lot of like side events and possibilities to come together and strengthen partnerships and strengthen advocacy, like partnerships and campaigns, so that like you can try to apply some external pressure onto your provincial government or like at the national government so that they take measures over that. So like there are different ways like that you can influence, although like if you want a more concrete like result immediately, like a more immediate result for that situation, I think like you have to focus at this intersection between national government, provincial government, and like try to mobilize a little bit more like at the community level, like in Quebec, and then probably get support from external groups as well. That's what I would gonna suggest.
So let's take one more question from Marie from France, and then we'll break out into our different groups. Marie, please go ahead.
Thanks. Thank you so much for the presentation. I'm still a bit confused about who exactly are in this meeting. So, for example, if it's SBSTTA, like, are the countries sending experts, since in scientific or in technicals, or the people are still negotiators and government representative? And then are there like IPES members that are there to provide? I'm a bit unclear about what's the difference in participation between SBSTTA and OEWG and then the corporate parties. And yeah, so thanks.
No, that's a great question. So representatives differ by country. Some countries send the same representative to SBSTTA and to the open-ended working groups as the delegation who's negotiating in the COP. So for some countries, it's the very same person. For other countries, it's the same person plus one or two other people. And for other countries, it's totally different group of people. So it really depends, in my experience anyway, on the country and how they've organized internally to respond to the CBD and to engage with the CBD. So yeah, there isn't kind of a hard set line. Sometimes I'm not sure actually, Melina, do you know if the IPBES representatives are the same in some countries as the
yeah, so basically, like the delegations, it depends, it's exactly what Amélie said, it depends on the countries. But usually, like the speaker, the delegate that speaks, it's either a member of the Foreign Affairs, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, or the Environmental Minister, or the Environmental Ministry. But then it's like this for SBSTTA, because there is the purpose of SBSTTA is to provide scientific and technical advice. So it's usually like the Ministry of Environment or the Agency for Nature Protection or Conservation within the governments, okay? But for SBI, because it's more political, it's usually gonna be either Foreign Affairs or like Ministry of Environment, but the delegations are very diverse. So for instance, for bigger countries, and it's the case of the EU as well, Like you're gonna have representatives from the Ministry of Agriculture, Energy, and all this kind of things, especially if the meeting is bigger. So for SBSTTA, you don't usually bring that many people, like because it's more sort of like the technical like people that comes, right? But the more political it gets and the closer it gets to COP. So for instance, at the COP, they are gonna bring all their top senior advisors of like Ministry of Agriculture, Energy, and so on. And that's why there is so much coordination needed within the delegations, because the Ministry of Environment obviously wants something that is probably going to be very different from the Ministry of Agriculture. So that is the difference. Now with IPES, a lot of the countries don't have capacity to have different government representatives to tackle different conventions. So some countries, it's the same person that does CBD, IPES, climate, CITES, all the environmental related conventions. So like it really depends on the countries, but like it's usually a mix. Okay.
I think, Mari, your question is great too, because for me, it flags something that maybe we haven't highlighted as much as we should. But Melina just mentioned it now, that there is a huge divide. So countries that have funding, that are able to send people, usually have bigger delegations, a lot more coordination. But there are some countries who only have 2 or 3 working on climate, biodiversity, IPES, and everything. And so just the capacity is not there, and the negotiating potential just isn't there, which is one of the biggest things about inequity in the CBD process.
But then just a quick thing, like this can also be an opportunity, because for instance, many smaller countries, they cannot tackle all the issues. So they reach out a lot to civil society groups to be able to understand the process and to be able to contribute. And in fact, Gibbon has been able to send quite a couple of like youth representatives to these conferences in the past. And then in many of the cases, like the countries would just kind of like hijack our youth representatives so that they could join their delegation and support. And then obviously then you have a direct link to that government. And like, yes, the CBD process is very politically unbalanced because of the forces, right? But it is a consensus. So one country can actually block the negotiations. One country can actually say like, no, I don't agree with this and I'm not gonna like go away. And this can be good, you know, in many cases, because it can be a very small country that is doing that. And if the person hangs there, you know, it's difficult for the person to hang. But if they can, you know, like you can be able to sort of influence more the process.